The world is divided into 4 spheres, each sphere divided among continents and nations. Nations are divided by borders and interests. These interests divide the news. We examine the impact of these divisions on people and power. This is Imaginary Lines. Welcome to the program. I'm your host, Michael Fox. Today is the 10th anniversary of the beginning of the trial against the former Iraqi president Saddam Hussein for the massacre of Iraqi citizens in the Shia Muslim town of Dujail. He was found guilty just over a year after the trial began and hanged in late December 2006. A decade later, however, Iraq is still a mess. For some context, I speak with Richard Becker. He traveled to Iraq twice on fact-finding delegations and has written and spoken extensively on the issue. But first, we turn to Brazil to debunk the news about a recent court ruling that opponents say could be the beginning of the end of the government of Dilma Rousseff. This month, Brazil's Federal Accounts Court announced that the government of Dilma Rousseff had manipulated its accounts in 2014 to disguise a widening fiscal deficit as she campaigned for re-election. Opposition politicians rejoiced at the ruling, claiming that the decision had definitively established that a crime had taken place and warning that it was the beginning of the end of the Rousseff government. Most media outlets, including Reuters, The Guardian, and many others, followed suit, running the headlines, "Brazil court rules against Rousseff, opens way for impeachment." The situation would seem dire, but let's take a step back. First, Brazil's Federal Accounts Court is not actually a court. It's an oversight entity of the Brazilian Congress, similar to the U.S. Government Accountability Office. Its decisions are important, but they're not actually rulings, nor are they binding. They're opinions, which in this case is now being sent to Brazil's Congressional Joint Budget Commission and then to the floor of the Congress to establish, in the coming months, whether or not President Rousseff violated the law. This was a fact missed by the majority of media outlets, who stated definitively that Rousseff acted illegally, creating the image that she was therefore guilty and subject to impeachment. Second, as Brazilian media analysts and several congressional representatives have pointed out, in this case, Brazil's Accounts Court, rather than actually doing its job as an oversight congressional committee, is playing politics. This context is key. It's important to recognize the facts from the hype. There are powerful groups interested in removing Rousseff from power in Brazil, and they're looking for any opportunity to do so, regardless of whether the pretext is real, fabricated, or imagined. 10 years ago, the trial began against the former Iraqi president Saddam Hussein. He was convicted and hanged just 14 months later. Saddam had been tried by an Iraqi court rather than an international tribunal in order to strengthen the country's shift to democracy, where for the first time people were going to be judged based on evidence presented. But there were many critiques. Human rights groups called the trial deeply flawed. A judge was removed mid-trial, and several members of the defense team were assassinated. Was it fair, or was it a kangaroo court, influenced too much by the United States? And what's the legacy? Richard Becker is the Western Region Coordinator of the Answer Coalition. He's spoken and written extensively about Iraq for at least 2 decades. In both 1994 and 2000, he traveled to the country on fact-finding delegations led by former Attorney General Ramsey Clark. Richard, it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you.
So today marks the 10th anniversary of the trial against Saddam Hussein. Looking back, what's important to remember about the trial at this moment?
Well, you mentioned kangaroo court, and this certainly is a prime example of a trial, an unjust trial, a kangaroo court. After the United States illegally invaded and occupied Iraq, following 13 years of a blockade that had taken the lives of well over 1 million Iraqis already, the body that was set up was called the Coalition Provisional Authority, and it supposedly had Iraqis in it, but it was really it was run by a dictatorship headed by J. Paul Bremer, who the Pentagon put into place. When they captured Saddam Hussein, that was in early December. A few days later, the Coalition Provisional Authority, headed by Bremer, appointed a special tribunal to look into the crimes of Saddam Hussein and his aides. And now this was a body that was the product of a completely illegal and unjust invasion of Iraq. Iraq the invasion of Iraq in 2003, in March of 2003, was not a result of faulty intelligence. It was the result of falsified intelligence that the Bush administration, Paul Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld, Powell, all of them knew very well that that information, that so-called intelligence, was false. And yet the United States went ahead and invaded Iraq anyways because they wanted to invade Iraq. They thought they could reshape the Middle East in their image by so doing. That was a crime against peace. And I say that, I want to emphasize that because that is the highest level of war crime under international law. It is, in fact, the crime for which the leaders of the Nazi Party in Germany were executed after World War II. So here you have the leaders of a government that has carried out a crime against peace, no question about it, invaded and occupied the country, hunted down the former president, and now is charging him with the crimes of which they were guilty in the very highest degree.
What's your analysis of the media coverage of the trial, particularly the U.S. media, looking back now 10 years later?
Well, the U.S. media, the mainstream media, has been very predictable about its coverage. In times like war times, the mainstream media largely and generally acts as another branch of the government. And really to support the government and to support the wars that are going on. So we had this real one-sided view of what was happening, and really very, very little criticism from that mainstream media about the fact that the war crimes committed by the government of this country tower over anything else that's happened in regard to it. And, you know, we should add that Ramsey Clark said at the time of the execution, he said, this will just mean more violence. And they kind of, those who referred to it at all in the mainstream media scoffed at that. But look at what has happened since. You know, that we would not have the ISIS, the Islamic State. We would not have Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Al-Qaeda in Syria and in Libya without the actions of the U.S. government, the war against Iraq, then the NATO war against Libya, the interventions in Syria. And, you know, many of those who at one time were, this is what's reported, many times who were with the Iraqi military that was forcefully and disbanded by when the U.S. took over, many of those top officers have allied themselves with the Islamic State, according to the reports that we hear. So what was a secular state? One where there could be no Al-Qaeda, there was no such thing, of course, then as the Islamic State. The war, the occupation has created conditions which now are somewhat out of control in the entire region.
And we're going to continue to follow the on-the-ground realities in both Iraq and Syria. Richard, thanks so much for joining me on Imaginary Lines.
Thank you.
And now for a look at U.S. politics.
Please welcome the Democratic candidates for President of the United States.
There's a lot of cynicism in U.S. politics. Part of it's driven by political leaders who take their position not on principle, but on what poll figures indicate. Here's the latest example.
What I know about it as of today, I am not in favor.
On October 7th, Hillary Clinton announced that she is now opposed to the highly controversial Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. The trade deal has been negotiated in secret, and it's been described as NAFTA on steroids. Most pundits and even some of her opponents were quick to point out what a dramatic flip-flop Clinton's new position represents. The frontrunner for the Democratic nomination served as U.S. Secretary of State under Obama, championing the very deal she now opposes.
The so-called TPP will lower barriers, raise standards, and drive long-term growth across the region.
According to one calculation by CNN, she spoke in support of the TPP no less than 45 times during her tenure as Secretary of State. Those who have followed Clinton's political career were likely unsurprised. She's practically made a name for herself flip-flopping on trade deals. Like it or not, promising one thing and doing another is of course just the political reality, particularly in the United States. But that doesn't mean that it should be. It's telling that voter turnout has been less than 60% for every U.S. presidential election since 1968. That's not an encouraging statistic. Perhaps if politicians actually stuck to their promises, people would feel empowered to participate. And that's it for today's program. Thanks for watching. I'm your host, Michael Fox. Please join me next week.